before you here today. Well, Steve invited me. Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate that. Early in my career, which is now 29 years long, so I'm getting up there a ways. I'm sure that's probably been a bit of a surprise to Steve, I think, or maybe a run for him. And early in my career with Oregon, certainly I was pleased to work for the Department of Transportation, as Steve mentioned, and got to know the history of the delivery of bridges for Oregon. And of course, a major part of that is Condi McCullough, our famous bridge engineer, who was named one of the top 10 engineers of the 20th century by the Engineering News Record, which is a magazine publication that covers engineering for the nation. And most people don't really, his impact really goes far beyond Oregon, quite some distance. He was a very significant individual, both locally, but then also nationally. Developed a great reputation, and certainly these bridges, we tend to, I think to some extent, living here, take them a little bit for granted, but they are very much a jewel of the entire nation. And in that respect, I came to, I think, get fairly early on a bit of an understanding of the appreciation for the aesthetics of bridge design, and really wanted to steer my career, at least to some extent, for that purpose. And I've tried to do that some. We've got some photographs here of some structures that I've had the pleasure to work on and be the lead on in a couple of cases. And I think they turned out quite satisfactorily. We'll talk some today about, first of all, just kind of trying to define a little bit for ourselves what the aesthetics of bridge design is, so we have a basis of context to work from. Look at a few examples just to help define that. Eventually we'll get to a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more. And the goal of today is to offer some instruction, some ideas for folks to think about in terms of the ultimate thing I'd like to leave you with a little bit is that when you're looking at a structure, or you're looking at even kind of any view, whether it's a building or a bridge or anything, is to maybe have a little bit of basis of some ability to look at those critically. Say, you know, this is a scene that I really like, you know, and then break it down a little bit as to, so why do I like that? Or why don't I like that? Maybe is the other piece, the other side of the coin there, which is kind of the effect that I like to try to work towards in my own work. Searching for Elegance, I kind of stole that title a little bit from a professor at from University of Toronto. He wrote a paper some time ago titled very similar to this, and I read it, and it was very inspiring. He gave me some of the background, looking at some of the background work that we look at here. So Elegance, quality of grace and style. I always think that person that I think of that really it got to a woman of grace and elegance. This is just out of the dictionary in terms of an example. And I think of Jackie Kennedy, for instance, as being a person of that who was always extremely well turned out, excellent taste, very, very, very well, very had a tremendous sense of her surroundings. Famously, they went to Canada early in the presidency with her and President Kennedy. And she appeared in a bright red dress with a hat and whatnot that was matched with the Canadian Mounties, for instance, right? Again, a thought process that she was thinking about where she was going, how she would fit in, and how she could play off of that. And it was a great success. They were very flattered, but it goes to a thought process of, I'm going into a situation here, and I really want to think about how I'm affecting that, in her case, for instance. Our stuff is probably a little more with the second one, being quality of pleasingly ingenious and simple neatness, the simplicity and elegance of the solution. An example of that, and I don't know if anybody can follow this one necessarily or not, but I always think of a carburetor in an automobile, being a little bit into cars myself and whatnot, as being a very elegant piece of work in that it just relies on a very basic principle of Bernoulli's principle. As the air rushes through there faster, you get a lower pressure going through the carburetor, which then pulls in more fuel, gives you that better that fuel mix, just from a very basic principle of how things operate. Fuel injection, or in our computerized fuel injection we have now, is really a much less elegant system. It works better, there's no doubt about that. It actually does give you a much better control over your system, but it requires you to define all the little pieces and parts. It just doesn't happen just because it's happening. You really have to work at it. That's why, of course, it exists now. We have a lot of computers and whatnot to run our cars, and it couldn't really exist back in the 20s, for instance, when they were looking for a way to mix fuel with the air in your system. Bridge engineering. We're here to talk, and we'll use bridges as most of our examples today. And one of this original talk was written to be presented to some bridge engineers to help inspire them and go forward and whatnot. So some of that's going to creep in at this point in time and whatnot, and I'm sure that at a few times. I'm sure that probably doesn't fit exactly with what everyone does here, but we'll talk about it some anyway. People build buildings, houses, courthouses, city hall, prisons, barns, you name it. Heavy civil, these are like water tanks, things along those lines. Roads, freeways, paths, highways, streets. We push dirt around quite a bit to try and make things work. And of course, are bridges any of these? And I say no, they really aren't. Bridges are fairly unique in their form. They gather pieces and parts of all those. Obviously, they have in our case, highway bridges, they have a road going across them, so they're a little bit like a road. But they're kind of like a building too, in that they have structure, foundations, columns, beams, and things along those lines. They are built very differently than roads. Roads are pushed dirt up, and then we pave them with asphalt, whereas a bridge is a structure that we build and then complete it with a deck on top of it. It's very different from a building as well. Buildings have walls, shear walls, and other things in them, whereas a bridge really doesn't. It's columns supporting a deck up above it. They're really very much a unique piece of work. One of the things that also makes them, I think, unique is that from a public structure standpoint, they have a very, very strong effect on any location where they're constructed, whether it be rural or in a city or things along those lines. So I think it's a privilege to be a bridge designer. The expertise to design a bridge is unique. We have our own codes and whatnot that we follow. To get a little bit misty-eyed or whatever, I guess you'd call it, bridges are the cathedral of the modern age. And the reason I come to that statement is in medieval times, when you think of those great European cathedrals and whatnot, the church was the economy. The church existed, and they employed people to build these big cathedrals, which is what they wanted. And that was really a big part of what kept the flow of money going at that time. Governments were very, very haphazard, really didn't even exist in a lot of cases. But it was the church that really did a lot of that and helped really kind of keep that economy rolling through some of the dark ages, the Middle Ages and whatnot. I think bridges serve much of the same purpose at this day and age. They provide an economic engine for our society. A few years ago, we went through what was called the Oregon Transportation Investment Act number 3, and there was 1, 2, and 3, and actually all were driven to the same sort of thing, although 3, I think, was the pinnacle. And it was a large bonding fund that the state put out to get us through much of a downturn in the economy, pumped a lot of money into a lot of hands, and really helped keep the economy of Oregon moving when it was having some difficulties outside of the public sector. Certainly we're all aware of the New Deal and the push forward to construct lots of public works during the 1930s, during the Depression, and that was a way to help keep, again, the economy afloat to some extent while we waited for something to happen, in that case World War II, I think, to really get things moving again. Bridges still serve some of that purpose to this day. So aesthetics. Particular theory, concept of beauty or art, particular taste or approach to what is pleasing to the senses and especially sight, although I think sound comes into the play here some too, maybe not smell so much, certainly not taste. Vitruvius wrote De Architectura, 10 volumes dedicated to Caesar Augustus. This is our first book that is any extensive work on architecture and what architecture means. He wrote it to Caesar Augustus as in his glory, if you will. Vitruvius was essentially the second man in charge of Rome at that time, and he was Caesar's architect. He was his builder, his engineer. He was in charge of roads, bridges, and did a great job, and again was really the very first guy who really sat down and thought about just what it means to build things. He defined 3 basic requirements of construction: utility or comedy, durability or firmness, and beauty or delight. So utility, durability, and beauty he picked as the 3 things that you need to deliver in any kind of construction. Those are the 3 important things. His 10 volumes are really they really are a fantastic piece of work, and they're still very much published and read extensively to this day. They are a very broad piece of work. They go all the way from planning. He'll tell you in that what's the right way to lay out a city. In his case, he lays it out. He's a military man, of course, at the time, and he lays it out to tell you this is the right place to site a city, the right way to build a city, to avoid being attacked to defend yourself from attacks by your neighbors. And there's quite a bit of militaristic action in terms of what is driving him forward, as there would be, as you would naturally think so. But he also defines what the qualifications are of an architect. And he also gets into even material specifications, for instance, right? Concrete was a known material to the Romans, and they used it quite extensively. And it was certainly known to them that one of the things when you're doing concrete, you want to make sure that the aggregate you use in it, the rock and the sand, are all nice and clean. Clay in your concrete will cause it to lose strength considerably. I had a job here on Interstate 5, in fact, where that happened inadvertently, and we had to tear it all apart again, because you could literally break the concrete in your hands because of the clay that got into it. So he gives us tests, for instance, in there about how do you check to see. What you do in Vitruvius' time is you go and get a clean white cloth, you put sand on it, you shake it, you dump the sand off, and if the cloth is dirty, well, your sand is too dirty. You need to wash it some more. If it's clean still after you've dumped it off, that's good. You can go ahead and use it. So utility and durability, these are pretty easy to define, I think, or at least imagine. Utility is, does the structure do what it does from the standpoint of highway bridges? Does it provide a deck for us to drive our car from this side of the river to the other side of the river? Does it carry the pipe that we want to carry? Does it deliver that piece of work for us? Durability, of course, goes towards age. Will it stay together? Concrete, steel are all very solid and give us great durability. Wood is actually a wonderful material, a little less durable, but certainly we've still got plenty of wood bridges around. In fact, I've got a contract now that I'm just finishing up or starting on, to replace a wood bridge out in Lincoln County that I'm looking forward to doing. Right now, our code generally says that bridges should last for 75 years. We generally like to think, particularly our more major ones, probably will go somewhat longer than that, and certainly they do. We've got a number that are certainly reaching or exceeding 100 years old in the state now. In fact, that's probably really, for some of our older ones, we've got a few that date back to the 19th century, but not very many. But our real first push of building in the state was right around the 1920s, so we're getting right into that range right now. So beauty, our third thing that we need to have. What the heck is that? And of course, that's in the eye of the beholder to a large extent. But for us as engineers and designers, we kind of need to put a little bit more definition to that, because some of us engineers don't have particularly great eyes. Maybe some do, some better than others. So here's a structure. This is the Markham Bridge in Portland, Interstate 5, going over the Willamette River. I think you're probably all familiar with it, and certainly I have probably used it more than once. It certainly provides utility, carries a lot of, 8 lanes of traffic across the river there. And its durability is quite good. Thank you, Steve. Steve helped out with some of the durability on this. and did quite a bit of nice work on it. I happen to think it's not a bad structure. It's certainly not beautiful by any great stretch, but it's certainly not a total eyesore, or at least not in my mind. But when it was constructed, it of course resulted in some backlash from the community, the Portland community area. They didn't think that this was really quite the sort of visual that they wanted to have in the city, and really wanted to see something more in the next structure that went up. And certainly then shortly thereafter, which was just a few years later, the Fremont Bridge was constructed, which is essentially the exact same bridge. 8 lanes of traffic, top and, with 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom. Goes across the Willamette River, about the same length, but certainly very different from a visual aspect, and quite a bit more attractive. This was the longest tide arch span in the world when it went up, so it was a very significant structure, and still is, for that matter, to this day. Interesting aspects of this bridge are the tie, which is this long beam across the top that goes down here, and it is a tide arch from here to here, but then it also has a deck tie on the top up here, which resolves its forces vertically down here in the bottom, which really is a good cost-saving maneuver. Some of the things that I might criticize a little bit with it is if you see the tie here, when you get to the approach spans, they go somewhat shallower. It might have been nice to have this line be continuous all the way across the same depth, but that's a fairly small criticism. I don't particularly like the real slenderness of the, it's interesting, of course, you go and you stand next to this, you can actually climb inside of those, they're so large. They look very thin here, but one of the famous things people like to do is climb up to the top and then shinny up the pole and take the flag down. Good fun. You do get, if you work for ODOT and you actually are in charge of replacing the flags up there, I do understand you do get hazard pay for doing that. So they look rather thin and small here, but of course they are quite large and whatnot. And I think a tied arch like this is a combination of the stiffness of both this tie and then the stiffness of the arch over the top. And I think this bridge, could use a little more beef in the arch and maybe just a little bit less tie, but that's just my own opinion. Other than that, though, it's certainly very nice, a lovely structure. And if Kamal Kamadoli was still with us, he'd let me know that I'm wrong. So another example, again, in Portland, the Morrison Bridge. This is a double-leaf bascule draw span with truss approaches. Again, from a utility standpoint, looks great. Durability, I think it's fine. From a beauty standpoint, the towers kind of look like they came off of a small airport someplace, and not really much thought given to aesthetics for the structure. And again, not unlike the Markham and the Fremont, we have another example just downriver that really is essentially the exact same bridge, again, going over the same river. This structure was designed by the Lindenthal firm out of New York. Gustav Lindenthal did this bridge, the Ross Island Bridge, and the old Selwood Bridge, all 3 of them at the same time from Multnomah County. Designed them all as one package. And this bridge was and is amongst the very, very few bridges in Portland that actually had an architect that worked on it. And the architecture does come out. You see some more interesting forms in terms of the little arches that are buttressing the house. Certainly the towers have a much more interesting form to them in an octagonal shape. We got some Italian tile on the roof as well. And generally speaking, just a little bit more satisfying form. The railing is more attractive, and it's just really a much more pleasing and inviting structure, I think. So just a few photos that we can look at. This is, of course, the Aquina Bay Bridge in Newport. This is a Conde-Macola bridge I had a great uncle that was an iron worker and helped drive rivets on that bridge some many years ago. And a lovely structure. I think probably just visually, probably the most attractive one of all of them that Macola ended up on the coast myself, personally. Really has some very nice repetitive form, the arches coming forward. And one of the nice things about these arches is they are all use the same aspect ratio. So the span to height ratio is the same for each of them. So each one of these, not only as they get taller, but they also then get a little longer in span as they reach across to each one of the arches. This provides a lot of regularity and balance to the structure, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Balance is a very important part of keeping the structure looking nice. A very satisfying structure. Some of the great pieces of work that he had on this, he liked these wonderful pylons, which again are hard to sell these days. You can't quite find folks that want to pay the extra money to put a pylon on the bridge, although it's been done here and there. But a lovely structure. Certainly one of the most attractive structures in the state. This is not a Macola bridge. This is done by engineer by the name of David Steinman, who worked nationwide. His opus, I guess you will say, was the Mackinac Straits Bridge in Michigan between the upper and lower peninsulas of Michigan, which is a huge structure, one of the longest in the entire world. It was the same designer as this. Steinman, interestingly, had a bit of a history with the Pacific Northwest. When he was very young, he actually had a professorship for a very short time at the University of Idaho. So he was in Moscow, Idaho for a short time when he was quite young. And there's an old photograph, again, back in Engineering News Record, of him out in the woods of Idaho, standing next to a bridge with his Boy Scout troop that he was leading at the time, on a small bridge they built for a trail, hiking up through the woods in Idaho. But he came back, and this is a little bit more than just the little timber bridge out in Idaho for us. Another piece of his work that's relatively nearby, and it's quite similar in size, is the Lions Gate Bridge in British Columbia, Vancouver, crossing the straits up there. That's also a David Steinman piece of work. Wonderful piece of work. This is from the 1920s. Used a lot of the Gothic arch. Certainly, I think Conde-Macola probably came out and visited this and looked at it. He must have, because there's certainly a fair amount of commonality between the techniques and the visuals that Steinman used here, and then what Macola reflected in a lot of his work later. But really a lovely structure. The cables on this, interestingly, were all wrapped. It's kind of an unusual bridge in that it uses what's called bridge strand. It didn't use a woven cable like you'll find on most suspension bridges. It uses like several large cables, I should say, that are stacked into various locations, and they aren't round. And then to finish it, they want to have it wrapped in a cloth that keeps the water out. And to make it round, they used pieces of Port Orford cedar to surround all the cables. So all the cables are in there, and then they have cedar wood around them all to give them that round shape, and then they could wrap them, which I thought was kind of an interesting use. And it lasted for, they did rehab it here, I think probably 15 years ago. So it lasted for, close to 75 odd years in that case. This is the Isaac Lee Patterson Memorial Bridge, also known as the Rogue River Bridge. This is at the mouth of the Rogue River, just along the coast. A Conde-Macola piece of work. Really a fantastic bridge. We'll talk about it a little bit later because there is some engineering things about this that we like to kind of geek out about over, and we'll talk about those some. But the repeating pattern across this really is very, very satisfying. and I think really shows a great sense of the proportion of this structure to its site and how I wanted to get where it was going. Here's any guesses on this one? This is the Hell's Gate Bridge in New York. Also designed by, this is early bridge by Lindenthal, again the same fellow who did the Burnside and the Ross Island Bridge here locally. This is a railroad bridge, and really I like this structure quite a bit because it has great mass. It looks very, 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 very stout, very strong, which is one of the things that I like to look for in a structure as well. I don't, again, kind of going back to my little criticism of the Fremont Bridge, I find it just a bit too thin for my tastes, whereas this one doesn't at all. This certainly comes off as something I wouldn't have any trouble walking across and worrying about falling in the river. And of course, it looks very much like the Sydney Harbour Bridge in Australia. And good architecture is original, and great architecture is stolen. You find a bridge that you like, and again, you want to bring it back home with you and whatnot, and certainly we do that fair amount of that. And again, kind of rating this for bridge engineers originally is, you shouldn't feel shy about looking at a bridge that you like and saying, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Keep your eyes out for a right site for that, and go ahead and use that project going forward. Again, a fantastic structure. If you go to Australia, they have walking tours. You can climb up on this one and climb up on top of it. They have tours. You can sign up for that. You don't have to. I don't believe you have to bribe anyone. And of course, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, which is kind of the thesis of all things you want to look for in a structure. The siding is fantastic. The elegance of its slenderness is beautiful, and even down to the selection of the color, the international orange that it's been painted, I think is all very very inspired. Probably one, I've heard criticism of the arch at this end, but I think it really works well because it responds to what's on the ground. It's got an arch at that end that crosses above the old Civil War fort at that end, and then crosses that. And this is Joseph Strauss, was the engineer on this, the lead engineer. And in this case, he searched out for ways to get himself busy. Joseph was very good at finding people to pay for work that he thought was a good thing to do. And this is one that he did. He convinced Marin County and San Francisco County to fund a toll bridge. It's still a toll bridge to this day, of course, and to build this fantastic structure. And so but he did have to respond to other folks that had the money, and they told him, and there are sketches, and I haven't included them here, of what his original concept was, and I can tell you it's, most people would use the word hideous, and I think that's probably kind. It's not an attractive structure at all. And they told him he needed to get an architect on board. So he hired a fellow, Irving Morrow, who was just a local architect in San Francisco, who did houses and various other small things and whatnot. And the reason, of course, he hired him was because he felt that he was somebody that he could probably dominate and let him know what he thought. Turns out Irving was fortunately made of a little bit sterner stuff and ended up really driving quite a bit of the architecture that went into this bridge. And we did end up with a very, very satisfying result at the site. And I'm certainly indebted to Irving because when Joseph Strauss does a bridge without an architect, it comes out a little bit less, much more utilitarian, certainly good utility and good durability in this case again, but from a beauty standpoint, I think it leaves something to be desired. This is, again, here in Oregon. This is from Rainier going across the Columbia into Longview. Again, structurally, very sound, a very solid piece of design work, but visually, just not something that you really want to put on the front page of your paper, I guess. So, this is a cantilever truss design, which was a fairly dominant long-span bridge design for quite some time, through the first half of the 20th century. Well, even probably moving into the 60s even. And we see a number of examples of this in Oregon. This is a little bit better looking. We got some curve at the top, chords. This is the Astoria Megler Bridge off of Astoria. This was designed by a fellow who worked for the Washington State Department of Transportation, and he came down on loan to the state of Oregon to help design this, and his name escapes me at the moment. Interestingly, story with this bridge, and I kind of always wondered what would have been here. There was a fellow that worked for Conde McCullough, kind of a right-hand man for him by the name of Dexter Smith. And Dexter and Conde both collaborated, and they wrote some textbooks and whatnot, but one of them was on suspension bridge design. And to his credit, Dexter was something of an expert in that regard. When the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsed, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse from some vortex shedding and whatnot at that site, designed by tremendous Leon Moiseff was the engineer that was the main designer of that bridge. A brilliant man, and unfortunately he kind of pushed his concepts and his luck a little bit too far on that bridge. But Dexter Smith was on loan to the state of Washington then to redesign the bridge that's there today. They built the new bridge on the old foundations that were there, that were left after the bridge collapsed, and Dexter really did most of the design work. And so it seems, I guess, turnaround is fair play, because then Washington loaned a guy down here to Oregon to design this bridge. The story goes, however, that Dexter at one point went in to Conde McCullough's successor. His name was Steve Stevenson, and he had laid out an entire suspension bridge to go across here the Columbia River in Astoria. And Steve looked at it and said, I don't think that's quite what we want to do here, and set it aside. So who knows? There might have been a big suspension bridge here to a very large suspension bridge here. It was close, but it didn't happen. Anyhow, but it's a fairly satisfying bridge. Again, it's got a lot of aspects to it that make it fairly utilitarian, though, and still keep it from being what one would call a really beautiful structure. Then you look at the Coos Bay Bridge, this one, the McCullough Memorial Bridge in Coos Bay. Again, the same structural form, cantilever, suspended cantilever truss bridge, a long span structure. McCullough attacks this with both curving top and bottom chords on the structure. Ties in very nicely again with a series of deck arches approaching from the north end, and really quite a satisfying bridge. Some more detail and interest in the piers rather than the steel A-frames that we saw on the other two bridges. Really a very nice, and really a pretty nice structure. This is one of only 3 bridges in the entire United States that are named for their designer. The McCullough Bridge. The others are, there's the Roebling Bridge, which is in, I think it's in Columbus, I want to say, Ohio. And then the other one is the Eads Bridge, which goes across the Mississippi at St. Louis. So McCullough really he had a great impression, like I say, ultimately. I guess if that's how you rate your bridge engineers, he's one of the top 3. It doesn't necessarily need to have to be an extremely large bridge. This is one that I did early in my career. This is up at Gates, Oregon. If you jump off this isn't on the highway. This is a county bridge owned by Marion County. It crosses into Lynn County. Lynn County, I think, paid for part of it too. But I think it was fairly satisfying. One of the things this bridge had was, again, I kind of went back to some of the forms, a little bit of the Gothic arch form here. One of the items there that somebody told me was, just as I was getting into this, a fellow by the name of Sam Grossberg had some forms like that he put in columns where he only put them about 1.5 inches deep, and he said you can't see them at all, you got to get crazy. So I really dug these in, and these are about 1 foot deep, so they make for a nice impression on those with the taper. Wanted to emphasize the horizontal lines. And I wanted to keep this as thin as possible, and that's why the columns slant in. So it reduces the span length here and tries to keep the superstructure somewhat thinner at the site. I think it reacts nicely to the site in that it steps down across the rocks and then again fits very nicely and works its way through the section. Received a number of awards for that, and I was very pleased with the result. Thematic elements. This is kind of an interesting discussion in terms of items that make things. We establish an aesthetic for these structures. This is the Bend Parkway in Bend. This is the Sisters Loop Ramp, which is at the very north end. This is US 20, I think, it goes across up here and then heads over to Sisters and then on up over the top of the mountains. You come down this way, and actually that's the off ramp for it right there. Then it makes a loop around here and then it goes across the bridge this direction. Early on in the Bend Parkway development, there was a plan to do an aesthetic development for that entire section. And some of the items that were chosen were things like using the cinder asphalt for all of the bike lanes, for instance, on the project. Those have long since been paved over and they're all nice and black now, just like anywhere else. But that was the original concept and was used. But all the bridges were meant to be single span concrete structures with this haunched form crossing. I had the luck of getting this one, which is the longest one of the bunch, and ended up having to be a rigid frame structure, which makes this really, I believe, to be the longest rigid frame, concrete rigid frame like this in at least North America. I looked up another one, and I kind of worked off of another project out of Canada, and I made sure this one was about 8 inches longer than his, so that I could make that claim. And but it was very satisfying. It's only 5 feet deep at the center here, which is very, very thin. I was really I waffled on that quite a bit because I was afraid we might get some sag in the structure, but I'm really pleased to say that here, many, many years later, there's just no evidence of sag in the structure at all. And it really rides very nicely, and I think ultimately a very satisfying result. Unfortunately, this is the kind of structure you'll see on all the overcrossings on the Bend Parkway until you get clear down to the very south end where some more work's been done to put in a couple more crossings. And while they've imitated kind of that thematic element of these haunched girders, they missed the whole point. The whole point was to do a clear span across the entire parkway, and they put a column right in the center. This is actually a girder bridge that has just kind of some fascia panels on the outside to make it look like that. And I think in the end, just not as satisfying a structure, and I think a little unfortunate that they didn't go for the extra 10% of cost or so to maybe make it go and stick with the theme for the overall project. Some ornamentation. These are things that bridge engineers kind of rail against a little bit anymore. They want to avoid some ornamentation. They think that the bridge should really stand on its own. I happen to think some ornamentation is okay. This was actually rehabilitation. This is the 8 Canal Bridge, Klamath Falls. This is Esplanade Street. And we retrofitted it with this, what's called the Texas rail, which is an open rail with balusters on it. And then these nice posts at regular intervals. And it makes for, I think, really kind of helps with enhance the urban nature of this. This is actually pretty urban. You can't tell with all the trees along the canal, but there's Alameda Street's right over here with a bunch of houses on the other side. And the high school is really just kind of right behind where we're standing and looking at this structure here. Doesn't need to be in Oregon. At the time I was doing this, I first did this presentation. I was working for a company called T.Y. Lin International, and this is one of their bridges in San Diego. This is a bridge that was used Safdie Rubinus architects out of San Diego, and I think it's really very satisfying in that the curved side of this structure and the even way that it flows into one another really reflects, I think, some of the sand dunes and the feeling of the sands on the beach, but also gives a wonderful light pattern with the shadow on the side. And I think really plays off of the idea of the Pacific sunset very, very nicely. I think very satisfying. Again, for a very simple bridge, I think it's a very satisfying piece of work. The coloring was chosen too, again, matching the sands of the beach. So, are you ready? This is kind of stuff that's more directed towards some bridge engineers, but certainly anybody that wants to jump in, feel free. We all want to produce beautiful, or at least good-looking bridges, and I think we want to do that for our community. I think recently, we had, unfortunately, or at least unfortunate from my perspective, the third bridge seems to have died on the table here in Salem. And I think there was a couple of things that were kind of interesting about that. I do think one of them was the renderings weren't all that great. So, again, a little bit more beauty, I think, in the renderings and whatnot might have helped a little bit, but we'll never know. And I do think that from a community aspect, it's important to get out and make that point that this is going to be something you're going to live with for the next, who knows, 100 years plus, and maybe even 200 odd years, or maybe more than that. And as a result, you really don't want something that's disposable. You really want to get something that's an enhancement to your community. So is it important? Certainly it is. I think that that's a given. Can beauty be quantified? Now that's kind of a tough question, and we'll talk about that just for a second. And what do we need to know to quantify that? And then can anybody do it? That's a good question, of course. Is it important? Certainly Vitruvius thought so. Equal time with utility and durability. He didn't say any of these was more important than the other. Certainly beauty is important as well. The owner thinks so, of course, faced with a choice and all else being equal, or at least close to equal. The public, which is typically our owner for most of the bridges we're talking about, will select a better looking bridge. The designer thinks so. Of course, we all prefer to show our pretty bridges. And the builder doesn't really care. That's certainly not true. Contractors put photos of their prettier projects on their websites. And they like to get awards for these things as well as much as anyone else does too. Interestingly, I guess I will push that just a little bit further in that some contractors maybe care a little bit more than others. There are guys who really push hard to put some real craftsmanship into what they're building and try to help you realize your vision, where there are others that are maybe a little bit less concerned about that. Aesthetic qualities of a bridge can transform a community and provide interaction. Do people love your bridge? Do people love the bridge? And here's a few examples we'll work through. The Monroe Street Bridge in Spokane, New River Gorge Bridge, the Rogue River and Depot Street Bridge, Depot Bay Bridge, Golden Gate Bridge, and the Brooklyn Bridge. These are bridges that are defining to their community that they surround them. The city of Spokane, this is the Monroe Street Bridge in Spokane. It's a project I was pleased to have an opportunity to work on for a rehabilitation. The project really took off all the stuff above the arches, all the way back, and rebuilt all that stuff, the deck and the spandrel columns and everything. The only thing that was left was really the arches and these tall towers. This bridge was kind of interesting because it was built in 1910, which is actually prior to our modern understanding of reinforced concrete. So it's really basically a plain concrete bridge, just a huge chunk of concrete poured into shape and whatnot. So pretty impressive, and it's easily, I think, the most massive bridge I've ever been next to in my life. And it really is massive. And it had an architect on it as well. The railing on this is a very interesting form, and it's a chain form to connect the north part of Spokane with the south part of Spokane across the river to suggest that. The little houses on here, the troll houses, are meant to reflect a Conestoga wagon shape. On the sides of this, and this is really unusual, is they have actually a cast concrete bovine skull that's on the side of these with horns and whatnot. And that's kind of one of my main contributions was I was able to, they were falling apart, and I wrote the specification and worked up how to copy those and make new ones for the rehabilitation. But the city of Spokane uses it on their logo. So certainly a defining part of their community. They see it as such. New River Gorge Bridge in West Virginia. They thought enough of it to put on the back of their quarter. Again, defining piece of work, civil work for West Virginia. Lovely structure, nice, light, tall. Again, I kind of criticize some for being maybe a little too light and feeling a little bit too spindly. I don't find that to be the case here at all. I think I find this bridge to be very light and tread nice and lightly across the gorge here below. Again, certainly a very satisfying photograph of a lovely structure. This is a bridge in Rogue River, Oregon. We'll look at this one 2 or 3 times. This is one that I did, and I'd really like to put my own stuff up mostly because I don't want to criticize other people's work too much. And I will say there are things to criticize about this. But the goal of this structure was, there's a lot going on here. There's a boat ramp right down underneath the bridge here with spaces to park your boat. It connects across the Rogue River. This is Interstate 5 over here, just in the background. You can see this if you're driving down the interstate. You can certainly see it off to the side. But then it connects underneath the Interstate 5 interchange to what is basically the downtown area of Rogue River, just on the other side of the interstate, and then connects it across the river to the other side and to the park that's above. So very much a situation where you're going to have individuals on foot interacting with your structure, both crossing the bridge across the top, but then also walking down in this area down here. So I really wanted to concentrate really heavily, and actually there's another trail on the other side too as well, a river trail that cuts down and goes underneath this side and then continues up the riverbank on that side. So all aspects of this bridge are really very open to people on foot to get very close to, and I really wanted to emphasize that. So I was really spent quite a bit of time thinking about, how do I want to present this with interaction of people who are at a very human scale and how they fit with this structure. And I came up with a number of different things. Every one of these balusters has a little flag holder in it. It's just a piece of pipe that has a threaded hole in it, so you can put a flag in it. And sure enough, we built it, and it wasn't the very next holiday. The local VFW came out and put flags in every one of the balusters on it. And actually, in 4th of July or Veterans Day and whatnot, it's really pretty spectacular. It's a nice piece of work. We did design a spire type of a flagpole that goes on top of each one of these that didn't get built. They kiboshed that idea, or no money showed up for it anyway. But I didn't want to think about how people would interact with this. Here's a visual of some folks that have had their wedding photo taken with the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. Some folks using the structure, using this bridge here for a bicycle event. And then again, the flags up here, some folks lining up on a bridge up here to put some flags up. So I accommodated this, like I say, on this structure. These are some photographs. This is a young lady here who has stood up. She's standing right in the V of these cables here. And I was really pleased to pick that up offline. She wanted to be a part of the bridge, and she put herself into the picture. Same thing here with this couple. They're at one of the overlooks at this corner right up here. And again, using it as a photographic opportunity. I think it was very successful in that regard, in that I think that it became a part of the community, and people are comfortable interacting with it. Bridges are very large, they're very imposing. They can be something you don't want to get next to, because they do feel very large and scary to you. One of the inspirations for this was an architect by the name of I.M. Pei. He did the pyramid in the plaza of the Louvre, amongst other things. He also did the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He came to prominence by winning the competition for the Kennedy Presidential Library at Harvard, which was never constructed. But again, Jackie Kennedy, going back, selected his design out of hundreds that were submitted for open competition at that time. But he also did, for the Smithsonian, he did the Museum of Modern Art. And in the Museum of Modern Art, there's a corner in concrete that's constructed at a very acute angle, pointing out towards the individuals. And he designed that, and the builder said, you can't do that. You form your concrete like that, it'll snap off, and you need to blunt that edge off, right? Well, IMPay said, no, we really got to do this. And I saw a video of him some time ago, long time ago now, where he's showing this to the individual and saying, see, and look, and he walks over, and sure enough, on that edge of that sharp corner, it's all dirty from people walking up and putting their hand on his building right there. And he was very, very pleased with that, because that was, again, his thought process along of, I want to achieve something that's approachable, something that people will want to put their hand on, for instance. And that was a lot of the thought process that I was trying to capture with this structure here. Again, people want to be in your pictures. This is a lovely McCullough Bridge. This is the Cape Creek Bridge on the Oregon coast, kind of reminiscent of the Pont du Gard in France, with the upper spandrel arches above, these larger ones below. Really, the only structure I think that he did that was configured like, I'm sure it was the only one he did that was configured like that. But really kind of a very interesting piece of work and unusual. Certainly didn't stick with just one design at all. He definitely mixed things up. Again, a fellow here who wants to be in the picture. Quantifying beauty. Arbitrary means are used, subjective, public survey to produce a score. Things like, public outreach. What do you folks think? Let's put different ideas out there, and we'll put stickers on them or something like that and see who votes on what. Cost, sometimes there's an aesthetic budget. We want to put some money to these things. Design, and I would say that I don't think aesthetics is particularly expensive. You look at the Selwood Bridge, for instance, in Portland that we just completed here not too long ago. It's really hard to put a number on how much money went into aesthetics on that, but it really wasn't a large amount. The big piece there being that in terms of the context of the overall job, $350 million or thereabouts, the actual money that went to the bridge itself for aesthetics was probably, maybe, if it was 10 million, I'd be surprised. And so as a result, from a percentage standpoint, really quite small. While 10 million is really a piece of money, from a percentage standpoint in these larger projects, it's really quite small. I guess before we jump back in again and whatnot, I mean, we had a number of nice questions during the break there and whatnot. If anybody has anything they'd like to ask, that would be a great time. One in the back there? Oh, we have a microphone. Okay, yeah.
This is Joel. I'm just wondering if there's some kind of a movement towards suspension bridges away from the drawbridges. They seem to be going up and over real high to avoid the drawbridge. For example, what's going to happen to the one in between Vancouver and Portland? That's got to be replaced someday. Mm-hmm, yeah. Will it still be a drawbridge?
Yeah, I would say yes. There is a movement away from drawbridges to high-span bridges of some sort. And the reason for that really is mostly, I think, cost and expense, because certainly the drawbridge takes quite a bit to maintain them once they're in operation and whatnot. And then also there's the traffic aspects. Of course, once the drawbridge is open, it shuts down traffic and whatnot, and folks just don't like that for some reason, So, and I will say that, one of the interesting things, I guess, about just a little bit of an engineering piece of information is all your bridges that go across rivers, navigable rivers and whatnot, they are all beholden to the navigation traffic on the river. That gets precedence and priority in essentially all cases. If a boat runs into our bridge, it's the bridge's fault. So, for being in the way.
Hi, this is Dave.
Oh, sure, over here in the back.
Hi, this is Dave. I just have to ask, what's your opinion of the Peter Courtney Bridge here in Salem?
Well, I think you see, I proposed on that bridge and didn't get selected, so My opinion is a couple of things about it that I think it's a lovely bridge, and I think it's elegant and it's very and I enjoy it, and I think it's very useful and goes great. The only things I guess I would criticize about it, since that's kind of what the question is I would think twice about the white color. It looks great when it's fresh and new. 10, 15, 20 years down the road, white can get very dingy, and nobody goes back and paints a bridge because it looks dingy. They only go back and paint a bridge because it's starting to rust and whatnot. So that could be a bit of a, I would question that choice just a little bit. And I think the lighting on it is kind of interesting as well. And we'll talk about that a little later, in that the advent of LED lighting has been really a significant change in terms of how we approach lighting structures in the last just a few years, less than a decade. And that bridge has just some very bright lights that follow the arches across the top. And I'm not sure that I've bought into that just yet from a lighting standpoint in terms of that aesthetic. I much personally prefer more of an uplighting approach and things along those lines. But that'd be the only things I would say about it. I think otherwise it's a very nice looking bridge.
Right here, on this side, the other side,
Oh, yeah, over here.
it's Irene, and I wonder about the great subduction earthquake and all these bridges. Which ones are retrofitted, which ones aren't? How many will really stand for many more years if they have that big quake?
Well, I can tell you this, I've said several times, I can hardly wait. I sure hope this, they've promised me this big subduction zone earthquake, and I sure hope it happens. And don't get me wrong, it'd be great if it stayed away forever too. But I've been dying to see if all the bridges I've designed actually will stand up or not. I gotta go out and see, because I've been spending an awful lot of time thinking about it and trying to design it into structures and whatnot, and I sure like to think I got it right. There will be some fairly extensive damage if that earthquake occurs. It's very hard to say what will be damaged and what won't. I will say that the extent that it will affect the valley will be far less than what you'll see on the coast. The coast will have, I believe the coast area will have some very significant problems, and some very unfortunate things will occur. I think you'll see that you'll have a number of problems with a lot of highways and whatnot will become impassable because there will be a bridge on them. I don't think you'll see widespread everything fell down here in the valley particularly. You'll see kind of what you saw in the spring break quake some years ago. You know, the Capitol building had to be shut down, unreinforced masonry. The church up in Mount Angel had problems. We did have one bridge that collapsed and shut down a highway. It didn't collapse completely, but it did come down off of its bearings. We were able to jack it back up into place, and it's still functioning today. So you'll see that sort of stuff, but more widespread, certainly, I think. The accelerations, you know, one of the things that does do with earthquakes is it does attenuate things over distance, and we are actually pretty far away from that subduction zone fault here in the valley. So we will see pretty good, you'll feel it for sure, without a doubt. In fact, I'm sure you'll know it'll happen. But certainly I think most modern structures, things built since at least the mid-70s, and maybe even to the 80s, will probably not have much in the way of problems other than, you know, things falling off of shelves and things along those lines. Things earlier than that, though, is a little bit more hit and miss, certainly. And there's a lot of retrofit work that needs to be done out there. And that's just my opinion. I will say I'm not a super duper expert on the whole thing and whatnot, but that's just kind of my background and what I've seen. So.
Gwenella, here. On that same line, I know you're conscious of the structures now, but the bridges that are still standing after 100 years, was that their intent, or it was just because of the way they built them? That, I mean, in terms of what they knew about engineering then versus what we know now, that they're still standing in the.
Oh, I think every bridge engineer goes into the idea that the intent, they'd sure like to build one that was like the Romans, and it'll be standing 2,000 years in the future. And it can be done. it really all comes down to maintenance. None of them can survive forever without anybody paying attention to them. They require paint. They require, rivets come loose and they need to be replaced. There's occasionally, they get hit by a truck and you have to cut the member out and fix it again and things along those lines. If you maintain a structure properly, its lifespan is really almost unlimited, with maybe a few exceptions and whatnot. But that's really what it's down to. And again, and maintenance costs, and that ultimately is where we end up, is kind of that question of, are we going to, and I guess just get on my high horse a little bit as far as infrastructure goes and whatnot, and that goes across the board. Whether you're talking about your sewers underground or your water, bringing water to your house, the power grid, I think, is one that probably gives me more pause than anything else, because of course it's being maintained by kind of these quasi-public-private entities and whatnot, who are driven a certain amount by profit. Maintenance is an easy place to cut back and maximize your profits. And I do think things like that are really things that are probably quite vulnerable from an infrastructure standpoint. I think your highways and your bridges and whatnot are probably a little bit better off because, again, they're not being managed by somebody that's driven by profit. They're being managed by somebody that really is there to deliver a service. So I think you're probably a little better off there. But overall, the water system in New York is frightening. It could collapse at any moment, seems like, or so they tell me anyway. And it's interesting, and they have problems with it too. It springs leaks and stuff all the time. So.
Hi, I'm Roz.
Hi, Roz.
Here in Salem, on Church Street, where it goes over Pringle Creek by Pringle Community Hall, that bridge, concrete bridge, was that designed by McCulloch? I had heard it was. Can you confirm that?
Pringle Creek Community Hall on Church Street. It could.
It's just south of Trade. Trade Street.
Oh, by the Safe Building? Oh, it probably was not. Although I don't know that for a fact. But certainly I'm familiar with I'm certainly familiar with the structure. It has a staircase and whatnot on it and everything. Yeah. It's a lovely, it's actually very nice. Yeah. But certainly was, I think, probably designed by somebody that was very much influenced by him, if it wasn't by him directly, for sure. Very much the style of the moment, of the time, for sure. I don't know. Not even sure how I would look that one up, to be honest with you, but I probably could someplace. There's no doubt a record somewhere. He was a local resident, of course. He lived on LaFell Street, just over here on Lincoln, and up on Lincoln Hills and whatnot. So, in the back.
Yes, my name is Bob. I've noticed in the last 20 years or so a type of bridge design that seems to be spreading all over the planet. At least wherever I've gone, I've seen samples of it. Single spire with cables converging.
Right.
Is this tendency that we're seeing a result of a change in material? What's driving that, or is it just a copycat design?
Well, copycat design, sure. Like I say, you steal it from somewhere else. That technology actually has been with us for quite some time. There are some that are quite old, even dating to the 19th century. And it is really a technological advancement is really what's happened there. A company by the name of Freycinet really drove that they're out of France, but then there's also a number of folks here in the United States that did that as well. And it's the concept of using some very high strength cables in a particular pattern, and it's just a development over time, and it has some very excellent construction aspects to it that really help with building those structures without any false work. So they don't have, the one thing you'll notice about all those, they don't have big timber centering and false work that's underneath them. They're able to build those up in space without affecting the ground below them. That's really the big advantage that they have.
I just might point out with this group, we could do questions all the rest of the afternoon. Do you have material you'd like to continue on and then do some questions at the end? You bet. I think we'll do some more questions at the end, and we'll continue on from here. I was just going to say that.
So that first part was kind of trying to discuss about what is beauty and how are we approaching this and how can we affect our community that way. Now let's talk a little bit about how, hopefully you'll take away from this part of how can some bits and pieces you can maybe use that are ways to look at the thing critically and say, okay, this is what I'm looking at. Maybe it'd be a little better like this or a little better like that. So if you're ever in a position where you can make some commentary on that, you can move forward that way. Back with our good friend Vitruvius, architects who have aimed at acquiring manual skill without scholarship have never been able to reach a position of authority to correspond with their pains, while those who relied only on theories and scholarship were obviously hunting the shadow and not the substance. But those who have thorough knowledge of both, like men armed at all points, again, he's a military man, have the sooner attained their object and carried authority with them. Vitruvius was saying that you need to be educated, but you also need to practice. So you need to be both the fellow that understands the architecture of your building, but also you should get out and swing the hammer some too, to make sure that you have a complete picture of what you're doing. Education engineering towards our architecture, visual aspects is very pathetic in our country. We don't really give there's no requirement to think about really the aesthetics of a structure in any particular program out there. Architecture is a little bit better in that they do give some basic instruction engineering in that case. And this is a result of the divergence of the practice. With the Industrial Revolution, again in the 19th century, we had a number of new materials that came on board. Prior to that point in time, you had the concept of the master builder. He was the architect and the engineer, really all rolled into one. And when we had more materials come on board, steel, reinforced concrete, and more expertise required to understand those materials, we saw the divergence. And now we have the engineer, we also have the architect, and they work as two different individuals now at this point in time. And that divergence has led then to the engineer being very specialized, and then the architect really taking on that piece of work for the visual aspects. Can anybody provide aesthetic design? Maybe. Approach it like any other engineering problem. Again, this is kind of directed towards those bridge engineers trying to get them. If you can't answer these questions, well, maybe you probably shouldn't try. Stick with running your calculations, and that's good because there's plenty of good work out there for engineers that can run calculations and do the analysis and whatnot. Is it important? Of course it's important. I think beauty can be quantified qualitatively. We can certainly look at a multiple set of groups and say, I like this one better than that one, I like this one better than that one, kind of like being at the eye test and the eye doctor, is it better, worse, better, worse? And kind of work your way through till you finally get to the top. What do we need to know? Educate yourselves. Again, going back to Vitruvius, we want to be, there's a certain amount of scholarship you want to do. You can do that through, simple things like even coffee table books, things along those lines. Texts do generally have some information for those things and whatnot. And can anybody do it? If the individual desires to and wants to, again, achieve that scholarship of the work, I think that's very much a doable thing. So, some education. Setting and environment, function, form, which follows. Form follows function, right? We'll talk about that. Line and shadow, which I happen to think is probably the most important thing that comes into play, particularly for bridges, because bridges are a horizontal construction as opposed to vertical like a building. And as a result, I think that you find that the aspects of shadow have a great effect on the way they look. Balance, I think, is extremely important. One of the things that, of course, with modern architecture and modern materials, we're able to kind of divorce ourselves from balance some and give some dissonance to our structures, which can be very attractive and very interesting. But overall, from a classic sense, I think that really you see balance being a very important thing. And then economics, we do need to keep our eyes on the bottom line. So where is the bridge? Urban or rural are really our two choices that we get. Lighting in urban environments is important. Again, we kind of talked about that a little bit with the DeFazio Bridge here. Or not DeFazio Bridge, the Courtney Bridge. The DeFazio Bridge is the one in Eugene. Railings, pedestrian access, plantings, flags, banners, furnishings, some of the things we talked about in terms of ways to make things more approachable from a human scale. Rural, clues in the surroundings. This is actually a very important thing that spends quite a bit of time, is what's the vernacular of your site? What are the rocks made out of? Are they granite? Are they basalt? You would approach something from the coloring standpoint, like the bridge we showed earlier in San Diego had that coloring that reflected the sand very closely, whereas other sites you wouldn't want to use that same color, for instance. Environmental influence, built natural environment. And then I think in a rural setting, generally you want to have ornamentation is going to be minimized. Certainly from an economic standpoint, that's what makes sense. This is Selwood Bridge, some early work. Safdie Rabin's architects was involved in this project. I had some fairly significant influence on this, I'm proud to say. And these are some early sketches, like I say, taking these to a public involvement group and having them judge and give a thumb to these and which ones we like and which ones we don't. This is probably the ultimate design where it started. If you compare this to the bridge as it is right now, it's a lot the same, but it's also quite a bit different too. But visually, it really gives the impression of what we were working towards. Some drama, again, some kind of offsetting the balance some. This is again Safdie Rabin's architects. This is down in San Diego again. This is that's where they're out of, by the way. Excellent siting, I think, in an urban center. Gives you crossing over top of some railroads, and it gives some real drama to San Diego, which really kind of lacks it. San Diego's not known for its architecture. I mean, how many people can identify a building out of San Diego? I think they wanted something really dramatic to add some identity to the community. This crosses right straight to the ballpark there on the right side of the picture. Again, going back to the Depot Street Bridge, looking at some of the things that were applied there. Pedestrian handrail, the lighting, in this case it's up lighting. I designed the lights for it myself to get just the way I wanted it. Some custom railing treatment. There's some furnishings on this bridge. We put some benches out there. Guy who was the reviewer on that job kind of gave, because this bridge is what we call post-tension, and it's post-tension both directions and kind of upside down, backwards and left, right, forward and backs. And the fellow who was a reviewer on this said, "So you're going to post-tension that bench too?" So I said no. And we did some things on there, some decorative things, put some logos on the bulb outs to the side. There's the Jackson County logo on one side, and the other side you'll see the City of Rogue River logo that was built into those. The form liner where it's pointing there, there's some black tiling on that. And actually that's another idea that I lifted from McCullough. North of there at Roseburg, Winchester Bridge, there's some red tiles that he has set in on that structure that I found very, very attractive, and I kind of pulled that forward and used those to give some very black accent lines on this structure. Again, very inexpensive, I mean, from an architectural standpoint, putting in a few tiles around the outside and whatnot, a few $100s maybe that it costs in the structure as opposed to just plain concrete. But I think very much worthwhile here since that's very much a public area. Simple Bridge, this is one that I designed that's just down at Cottage Grove area. In a rural setting, again, a very different sort of thing than you would approach from the Depot Street Bridge. A real strong emphasis on linear form, shadow lines and whatnot. I really think this bridge turned out very nicely. It's a very basic, boring old freeway overpass, but that's part of what I want to emphasize some too is, you shouldn't just look at your major river crossings and stuff and whatnot. Looking at just a freeway overpass can certainly go a fair distance to making sure that your built environment is something that you just are paying attention to. This one, Elk Creek, this is actually in and of itself a fairly unattractive structure. But again, using the weathering steel, the dark colors on this, I think fits into the environment quite nicely. Certainly took a very nice photograph here. This bridge is an interesting one. This is in Redding, California, sundial bridge. I don't know if anybody's been down to see this or not. This is done by an internationally famous designer, architect, bridge designer, Santiago Calatrava, Spanish gentleman. And I do think context is a bit of an issue for this. Certainly it suggests it's much more of an urban environment to me. And while it is in basically an urban, it's in a park setting inside of Reading, I do have a little bit of issue with just the very modernist piece of work in terms of around the natural setting and whatnot. But certainly dramatic and a tremendous piece of work. The interesting story behind this one is this was built by a company called Skanska. And if you're up around Portland, you'll see their signs up. They're a very large international contractor. And I worked with them on a project for BART here a few years ago. And some of the guys who were on my project were fellows who had been working on building this bridge up in Reading. And one of the things that we do whenever we build a bridge is the contractor redraws all of our plans into working plans and hands them back to us. And then we review them against our design and say, yeah, and then we put a stamp on them that says, it's approved, looks good, or approved as noted. We note a few things on there, or we'd reject it, put a rejected on there. Sometimes that's always fun. But in this one, the Calatrava being the engineer on this, they don't use reviewed or approved as noted. They send back a stamp that says your submittal is one with the bridge. My understanding of form follows function. This is certainly a term that's been kicked around. It's accredited to Louis Sullivan, who's the father of modern architecture. And the more exact quote is form ever follows function, if that makes any difference to you, but I thought it was enough to put it here. And many have interpreted this to emphasize a real emphasis on raw structural form and eschew ornamentation. And I tend to disagree with that conclusion. I mentioned ornamentation earlier. While I think that's part of where it's going, I don't think that's really the case. In some of the 19th century, again, a dominant architectural style, this is Beaux Arts, the Academy of Music in Paris. And the basic question is, so where's the front door? You come to this, and how do I get into this building? Is its form suggesting its function to you and whatnot? Certainly a dramatic piece of work without a doubt, and sculpturally even quite exciting and beautiful. But functionally, it probably has some things that are maybe need to be considered. Louis Sullivan, this is a bank in the Midwest. You want to know how to get into this bank. Well, the door is very obvious where you want to go to walk in the front door on this. But still, quite a bit of ornamentation. I think quite an interesting structure, and I would love to go inside of it. I think it's probably interior is great. I'm really very disheartened that they tore down the old First Bank building here in Salem. In case you'd ever been inside of that building, it really was. From a modern architecture standpoint, in this context, it was really one of the most interesting buildings in the entire city here, and it's really too bad that it was never able to find a new life as something else. But it's gone now, and that's what happens, So function. Highway bridge function is, of course, the obvious: carry highway traffic across. This is the Hoover Dam bypass bridge. A dramatic structure, to say the least. I haven't yet been down to see it, but it's certainly on my bucket list to take a trip down and visit this. It's an interesting structure in that it was actually designed by the same fellow who did the Crooked River Gorge High Bridge at Terrebonne, and used the same construction techniques. The Crooked River Gorge Bridge over there provided the background, if you will, the first step, and then this is kind of the more dramatic, bigger piece of the same piece of work. And it's interesting to see how engineers work that way and go forward. Conn-McCullough did that quite a bit too. You can see his tight arch bridges along the coast But it's very fascinating to look at them from an engineering standpoint, because the first one he did is designed internally quite different than the last one he did. He was working he didn't just come up with it and then just decide, oh, that's a great way to do it. Refining. They're all quite different in terms of how he put them together, because he was always working to improve himself, even though externally they look very much the same. But anyway, this is to enhance our built environment, beautify a given location, Hoover Dam bypass. And again, the bridge at Terrebonne. I think this is an interesting one in that the forms here are very, very simple, very rectangular. Again, does eschew ornamentation, but certainly that's not something that you can walk away from and say that's a bad idea. This worked out very nicely. I think the choice of the red color there was, again, fairly inspired as well. A very good piece of work. I think a very attractive structure. I also think that it is interesting in that it sits in this group of these three structures, whether it's the original Modjeski and Masters railroad bridge to the one side, and the Conde-Macola truss arch that's now closed, and then this bridge, which is the more modern interpretation of the same thing. All of them kind of that arch form looking forward, and then showing a real excellent collection of how engineers think of things and how designers think of things throughout the ages. Form follows these functions. Again, here's actually down in the corner, there's that Rogue River with flags on it. There are small form details. The staircase in the left side there is on the Yaquina Bay Bridge again, the north end of that structure. There's a lovely piece of detailing of that staircase that comes down off of that bridge. Very small form items, again, very much at a human scale, things that are meant for individuals to be part of and really next to. Lines should strengthen and reflect the intent. Horizontal lines should be horizontal, and vertical lines should be vertical. There are exceptions. They should follow grade with retaining walls. This is one that Leif Hogenstad taught me some years ago. I did a retaining wall and I gave it to Leif, and as Leif being Leif, he was checking it for me. I was young. I don't know if I was even a professional engineer as yet, and I designed this retaining wall, and I gave it to him, and he gave it back to me 2 or 3 days later and says, "Here, I fixed it for you," and he redesigned the whole thing. He says, "You want to do this and this and this because it looks way better and whatnot." So thanks, Leif. But a wonderful engineer, extremely productive engineer who did a tremendous number of bridges here for the state of Oregon, who unfortunately as well is no longer with us. Things to look out for, this is kind of the shadow aspect. It may be a little bit hard to see here, and again, this is kind of directed towards the bridge engineer. In this case, the lower bottom, this is on Highway 26, just west of Portland. The lower line of this bridge, it looks like it goes up at the support, and it really doesn't. It actually goes out. The bulb on the bottom of this beam flares out at these locations, and it causes a visual aspect. It actually did get messed up a little bit. The contractor actually messed this up some too, so it's enhanced both ways. But the shadow line makes it look like it goes up like that. And so things to be cognizant of. If you're looking at this just on a piece of paper, it's a straight line across a piece of paper. But ultimately, when you get to the shadow line, it gives you this kind of interesting little effect, which really isn't very satisfying from a detail standpoint. You can get yourself into an interesting compound miter. This is right here in Salem. This is Highway 22, and it's just the natural result of the flare on the bottom of this support coming up, and then the fact that it's a skewed angle across the top. So you end up with this kind of odd line there. There's nothing wrong with it. That's just the way it works out, but it isn't very attractive. It's not, again, not very satisfying. It certainly invites the question of, so what went wrong here? Retaining wall, again, this is one that has just corded points between a lot of spots. One of the difficulties of doing retaining walls is the temptation is to follow the ground line behind them and put in a line for everything that you can find that varies. ultimately, you really want to just have things that are nice and smooth, put curves, and minimize the number of moves in those things. I don't have a photograph of it here now, but the Iowa Street wall that's along Interstate 5 in Portland, they constructed it about 5 years ago, is really an unfortunate, really an unfortunate result. And I have talked to the guy who designed it, and he says, yeah, I told him that wasn't the right way to do it. But even still, anymore, fortunately, they've gotten into planting a lot of vines that cover these things up. So these do get covered up over time, and they aren't quite so, sometimes they aren't quite so difficult to look at. Mass balance. This goes back to really the classic form. In Roman times, Vitruvius's times, it's interesting how engineering evolves over time and whatnot. Here it is, we're standing here the 50th anniversary of the landing on the moon, right? I cannot imagine being on the engineering team to do the moon landing with the technology that was available to us in 1969. The challenge must have been just beyond daunting. It boggles my mind. The interesting thing is I look back further too, and I look back at Roman times. The Romans had trigonometry. They didn't have algebra. They certainly didn't have calculus. Certainly no computers or things along those lines. And so they built, and yet they built some tremendous structures. The Pont du Gard in France is an amazing piece of work. But the Colosseum, the Pantheon, which is a domed roof that is still amongst some of the largest dome roofs in the entire world. A tremendous piece of work. How did they do this? And the answer is, well, I think the answer anyway is balance. It was a matter of sense of balance that they used very much in their engineering, or in what we would call engineering, but in their design work that they did, and looked for that balance in their structure. And that's what really gives them, and makes them look nice too. And that's one of the things why that makes them, I think, very attractive, is that they are very well balanced. Unbalanced structures aren't very attractive. Sometimes you can't avoid it. That's the Siuslaw River Bridge on 126 west of Eugene, but had to get a road underneath there, so we had to put a shallow span across there. Not very attractive, but ultimately the only real solution that was available to us. The super elevation effects down in the lower picture there are kind of give a very strange feeling to that structure. I think maybe that structure might have worked better with vertical columns in that case and whatnot. But they can really kind of catch things out and can be difficult to deal with. Some balanced solutions, backspans, haunches, and tapers are a nice thing to use. Modified the terrain for some soft elements to give some mass to your approaches. A really good photo of that, I think, is here at the top of this one. This gives some real mass to the landing point for the structure, which tends to anchor it, gives it, again, a sense of balance and a way for it to land and to hold it down. I think that the structure on the bottom is, again, a very basic freeway type overpass structure. Fairly well balanced, nice, even lines came out with a fairly satisfying result there, again, for a very, very basic structure. That's at Curtin Interchange, south of Eugene. Does aesthetics cost more to achieve? No and yes, or yes and no. No, I think following the basic principles should result in minimal, if any, cost increase. Items consider some trade-offs: steel, post-tension structures, office supply savings elsewhere in the project. We used that Saginaw Interchange bridge that we showed earlier. One of the reasons that bridge is shaped the way it is because it's been, again, made to be as shallow a structure as possible, because the more I built up the interchange there, the more we were impacting wetlands off of either end of the structure. So we got into needing to do a lot of mitigation for those, which is quite expensive. And that's a post-tension structure, which kept it very, very shallow. Tall abutments mean shorter spans. Line on structure, absolutely no extra cost to keep your line. Make sure you're paying attention to your shadow lines. There's no cost to that. One of the difficult items that we have as bridge engineers is we do use off-the-shelf items. Our girders are made in Harrisburg, down the road, from a pre-stressed concrete standpoint, but also even our steel girders are all manufactured. We bring them out in pieces and parts. It's like building with Legos to some extent, and we only get rectangular Legos. We don't get all the fancy ones. So it can be difficult sometimes to bring those together and use those various pieces and parts to come up with a really satisfying aesthetic quality. I wanted to take a little bit of time here as we finish up to look at some of McCullough's bridges that are less well known, I think, and maybe encourage folks, if you're interested, to take a trip out and see them. They're local, not too terribly far away. Well, in the state anyway, if in the state's local. And some that I think that are really pretty spectacular that just don't get much airtime at all because of their location. This is Nehalem River Bridge. This is right at the intersection with Highway 103, going out Highway 26 towards Seaside. You get about 2/3 of the way there from Portland, and then this highway takes off to the north. You can go on this up to Astoria, but right at that intersection between those two highways, you'll find this arch bridge here, which I think is actually one of the most well-sited structures that one of these single arch, deck arch structures. It's got great height. It's really just it's wonderful in its setting, and I think it's just one of the most fantastic structures that he did. Dry Creek or Dry Canyon Bridge. This is near Mosier. I believe this is one of the I was told at one time this was the very first bridge that McCullough ever designed for the State Highway Department. It does date into the 20s. It's certainly one of his early ones. Whether it's the very first or not, it's certainly amongst the very first that he did. This has recently been rehabilitated by the Highway Department. This is an older photograph, shows a lot of chunks missing off of it. That's all been repaired. Really a wonderful little bridge. This is on the Rowena Loops up above Highway above 84, again, between Mosier and Rowena, which is a wild piece of highway if you ever want to drive something and take your sports car with you, I guess, for that one. But really a lovely little structure, wonderful in its detail. It has many filigrees and other items on it. The columns have capitals, the little spandrel columns have capitals on top of them, etc. One of the interesting things about this bridge structurally is that the arch sits quite low, and we have columns in the center span. One of the things you learn early on when you do these deck arches is you want to actually make those as solid with the deck as possible. That's really actually ultimately maybe might even be called an error, I guess you might say, or not really an error, but something that that makes the analysis a little bit different. And again, I think probably an example of McCullough's ongoing education that he gave himself. He continued to learn throughout his career. Perry Arch, this is way out in Eastern Oregon near La Grande. This one was rehabilitated by my current company, OTAC. I was able to rehabilitate this structure and clean it all up. Some lovely things in this. You can see the dentals underneath the deck. That's an item that McCullough used occasionally. Very nice structure. I think this one's a good example of reacting to what the surroundings are giving you. In this case, there's a railroad underneath one end, and the structure reacts very nicely both to the river, but then also includes the railroad, and I think is really a very satisfying structure. Again, one that's, you drive along the freeway and they do have an exit that says, go over here, take this exit to see the historic arch. So it's not too hard to find. It's just off the highway. The Jacob Conzer Bridge. If your friends ever come to town, you want to show them a great example of a McCullough Bridge. This is probably the closest one we have here to town that's really easy to see. This is in Jefferson. Jacob Conzer was the fellow who ran the ferry at this location on the river before they built the bridge, hence it gets its name. How he got a ferry across that river right there, I'm not really sure. Seems like you could probably wade across it for the most part, but a lovely piece of three arches run together like that. A good example of some of these pylons at the bridge ends, some of the architectural elements that McCullough liked to incorporate in a number of his structures. Like I say, very close by. Pretty narrow, but still functioning very nicely to this day. Outstanding sighting. Economics. Extra first costs. There are some things like custom form liners that can come into these. Bridge railings anymore, we're not getting much chance to use anything with bridge railings on our structures. You won't see, sadly, you're not going to see much in the way of an attractive bridge railing on structures as the future goes forward. I say sadly, depending on how your perspective, I guess, but safety is really taking the front chair on that, and aesthetic bridge railings are really going by the wayside in favor of making sure that they're the safest thing that possibly can put on these. Surface treatments, there is staining. We use quite a bit of acid stain on structures, which do a wonderful job. The Depot Street Bridge had quite a bit of acid staining done on it to put some color to it. Extra long-term costs, aesthetic lighting, those take electricity. Like I say, one of the great things about the LED lighting is it's a very, very low draw in terms of how much energy it takes. So as a result, it's fairly inexpensive compared to what we used to put on bridges. So I do think that's going to continue to go forward. Actually pretty exciting stuff. The Tillicum crossing in Portland is programmed to reflect the mood of the river with its lighting that's on it. So it kind of reflects the color, the temperature of the river, and the elevation the river's flowing at and whatnot. I have no idea what the code is, what green means or blue or whatnot, but it has been set to that. The one here just north of town at Woodburn that they put LED lighting on at the Woodburn interchange right now, which I think is very nice. It does a nice job. So setting environment, field visit, always we encourage, try to do that as much as possible. Form should follow function, but need to understand the function first. You know, are we in fact trying to make an aesthetic? Is that part of our function here is an aesthetic achievement? Line and shadow, I can't emphasize that enough. I think that's really the most important part of any bridge design piece of work. And balance. There are opportunities to unbalance this structure for dramatic effect, but generally speaking, balance is the way to go. And costs. It can cost more only if it is chosen to. If you really should be cognizant of the costs, and we should spend some money. A fellow by the name of Christian Menn, famous bridge engineer, felt that you should always be spending at least 10% of your budget on aesthetic elements. That's me. Questions? Go ahead and get the microphones out here. Let's go first. There we go.
My name is Jeanette Flaming. Thank you for this. I do have a question. When I'm driving over a bridge, I really like to be able to see through the railing down to what's below. And it seems like so many bridges now, they block that, so you can't see that at all.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
And I hope that's not a safety issue, because there's safety things that you can put up. But that, when you're driving, I think that's really significant.
Oh, absolutely.
Visually. Yeah. And I went across that bridge at Boulder or Hoover Dam, whatever it is. When you're on that bridge way up there in the air, you don't have any idea where you are. You don't have any idea that Boulder Dam is down below.
Mm-hmm, yep.
I mean,
true.
It just blocks out everything. You could go past that and not know it. So anyway, that view through that railing, I think is really important to the passengers on the bridge.
There are some options still available to us that we like to look at. There's some steel rail type options. One that we use, and there is actually a concrete one now as well, although it's quite expensive. And there's only one bridge in the state that I think it's actually been put on. But the steel railing still does give you a view through the rail. The issue with that one simply is that it is not favored by the guys who do the maintenance, because when people hit it, they got to go out and fix it. The great part about a concrete rail that's solid like you see is people hit them and all they leave behind is some tire tracks on them, and that's about it. And so as a result, the department really likes to have those in place, and it is a safety issue. In fact, you would be surprised, they have what's called a TL6 railing, I think it is, and it's about this tall, and it's like a solid wall of concrete, and it's meant to hold semi-trucks in and whatnot, and I personally rue the day that they actually start requiring us to put it on our structures and whatnot. They can really be, it'll really feel like you're in a prison. And I just happen to think that that's ultimately, it's always a tough thing, because you certainly don't want to be anti to safety at all and whatnot too, but sometimes you got to kind of balance things out a little bit, I think, so.
Hi, this is Don. Is the I-205 bridge wearing out? Or if it's a matter of painting, why don't they just paint it? Wouldn't that be cheaper?
The one in Oregon City, you mean? They're getting
No,
ready to
the
do that?
I-205 bridge across the...
Oh, yeah, I-5 across to Columbia, yeah. It's now over 100 years old, the older one. There's two of them there. Oh, 205? The Glenn Jackson Bridge? Oh, I think it's still in perfectly good shape. I don't think there's anything particularly issue with it, but there's no, yeah. I mean, it requires maintenance like all of them do and whatnot, but there's no real issues with that one at the moment.
Aren't they talking about building a new one?
No, not there. They were talking about building a new bridge that's an alternate to it, that was upriver just a little ways from it, but not replacing that one. So, and that has been presented out there, and they've talked about that. It's not really getting off the ground, I don't think, from a money standpoint. So, but who knows? Might happen someday. The back.
How many bridges are being built in the U.S. these days? A lot fewer than 50 or 75 years ago?
Oh boy, hard to say. I really don't know. Fewer than 50 or 75 years ago. 75 years ago, we were in the interstate, still working the interstate and whatnot, and bridges were going up left and right as part of that construction. We are at the point of time where our highway system is largely maintained, meaning that we replace bridges that wear out or are too narrow. We need to have a little bit more capacity on them because they're in an urban area and whatnot. So the equation's a little bit different. It's not new highways going in so much as it is taking care of the existing system. I think it's probably fairly consistent over the course of the last 25, 30 years. Sometimes up, sometimes down, kind of depending on what tax revenues are and whatnot. It generally goes towards how much money you got to spend. The one thing about highways is it's all about opportunity cost. Everything that a highway department does is at the expense of not doing something else, because there's never enough budget to do all the things that they would like to do. So.
Jenks here in the front. At the south end of the Walport Bridge is a really lovely little museum to Conde McCulloch. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's well worth the stop there. My question has to do with the curve, and I see in this picture here, and I've read about that huge bridge in the Pyrenees from Spain to France, and I read that they had to curve it because people would get confused and would drive off if it was too straight. And how would they know that anyway? Can you tell us anything about the curving of big bridges like that?
I hadn't ever heard that particularly in that case. There is some interest in those. I mean, the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge in Louisiana is an extremely long bridge. I don't know how 10 plus miles long, and it's straight as an arrow. I don't know if they have any problems with it particularly. Certainly, straight roads always have it is low. It stats down on the road. Yeah, but I hadn't heard that as being a need particularly on that one. But I would like to. Actually, it's a pretty exciting bridge. It's huge.
Hi, this is Cassia. A few years ago, we had a presentation on bridges also, bridges of Oregon, and basically what a terrible state most of them were in, and the kind of money that would be required to maintain them and retrofit them and all this kind of stuff. So the question is, and then we passed a bond measure, I believe, to help pay for some of that. How far have we gotten along that process? Because if I remember right, it was some astronomical number of bridges that were really in need of repair, hundreds.
Well, I don't know if I'm the number one expert on that, although I will say that amongst some of the things that I've done in my career was, one of the ones that I did was I was a production manager, is what they kind of called me, of looking at every last one of the bridges they identified, that 350 bridges in the state that we looked at for that, and produced a report for every one of them. And it was two different firms that did it, and the firm I was working for was the lead firm. And so the final quality control of all those went through one person, and that was me. And I think I'm the only person that read all 350 of those reports. And I remember it to this day because I tell you, read 350 of those reports and they're all the same. The 350 with one starts getting pretty hard to read. But we completed that project, that funding, and it went quite a distance to replace not all of those bridges. Many of them were found to be sound after they were looked at. Many were repaired, but quite a large number of them were also replaced. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a successful program in that regard. The issue with that one that's kind of been a problem was, of course, it was done with a bond measure, which requires finance to cover it, and it really caused some difficulty with the Department of Transportation. In the ensuing couple of years after that, it was very, very difficult to find funds. So there was a couple of years where ODOT really built almost no bridges whatsoever, at least as far as the state was concerned. There were some local agency things that went on, but it kind of has its ups and downs.
Over here. Doesn't Oregon's 1% for art that applies to public buildings apply to highways and bridges?
I do not know that it does to bridges in that context. They do have some, in some areas, there's a requirement for a certain amount of cost that goes towards like pedestrian work and whatnot. And there are set asides for some of those and whatnot. Make sure that we're taking care of the pedestrian bicycle work. But I don't think there's an art tie-in for that piece of work.
Thank you very much, Scott. We are out of time.
Mm-hmm.